The next thing we're going to do for our pawn game is figure out how to make our characters look a little bit nicer. So the first thing I did was I pasted a picture for my background. And then I opened another FLAW file and I made a new character. I took a bitmap object that I found offline from FlashKit, and I made that bitmap object into a movie clip object. You can see that he is a cat movie clip object. I named him Cat. Inside of this movie clip object, inside of his timeline, I changed his timeline to look like this. Now let's go over what I did here. I made an actions layer. Inside of that actions layer, I have one action on frame 1 called stop, so that his action won't happen until I tell it to happen. So on frame 1, you'll put stop on the actions layer. Now on frame 2, inside of my labels layer, I name frame 2 a certain label that I remember the name. Such as for my cat, I named this frame 2 Claw. Remember that you name your frame over here in the properties panel for that frame. So you have to click on frame 2. It has to be a keyframe. So remember to click on frame 2 and say insert keyframe. And then name that keyframe a name. You'll see that name appear on your timeline. Alright, now let's look at this layer here. This layer here obviously shows my mouth and my eyes. Notice that there's no tweens on this layer. But you can see that I added some keyframes. On this keyframe, you can see part of his eyes there are at half lids. So I copied and pasted half of that circle. On this keyframe, the eyes are gone, so I deleted those objects. On this keyframe, I pasted them back. On this keyframe, you can see his eyes are all the way open, such as in this one. And in that way, it looks like he's blinking. Now let's look at this next layer. This next layer is a tweened layer. You can see that it is blue. That tweened layer is his arm. Okay, so his arm is a movie clip object. Here's the cat arm movie clip object. So I selected that cat arm. I then F8'd or made that cat arm a movie clip object so that I could tween him. I right clicked and added a tween to him. And in that tween, in this keyframe, I raised his arm up. And the last keyframe is a copy of the first keyframe where his arm is down. So his arm goes up and down. Okay, so now you can see that his arm going up and down. Let's look at this layer here. This layer here, I put his tail. And we'll get to that in a second, I guess. And then on this layer here is our cat object. So same thing over here. I added one more movement to my cat. On the first frame, I put a stop. And then on the second frame, in my labels layer, I named that label. I named that frame tail swish. So in his properties panel for that frame, I called it tail switch. You can see that I made this tail a movie clip object. object of type tail. There he is in the library. I then tweened this tail. You can see if we just look at the tail itself, so that we have a keyframe down here for when the tail reaches its down point. We have a second keyframe and a third keyframe, so that the tail will move up and down. Now remember that these animations in this timeline is internal to my cat object. So now I'm going to copy that cat object, go over to my Pong flaw, go into the library, double click my player object to edit him. Some things I can note about my player object is that his height is 150, his width is 55. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that. Notice I'm inside of my player object. I'm going to click on that rectangle, that shape, and I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to Control V and paste my cat. His height is also 150, or pretty close to it, so he'll look about the same. I'm going to go ahead and Control S and save that. And now when I run my code, instead of a rectangle, I have my cat. Now I'd like my cat to raise up his paw and hit that ball every time the ball comes near him. If I look at my player object and I double click on my player object now, I can see that inside of him is that cat object. So I'm going to click on my player object. I'm going to go over to his properties, and I'm going to name that instance of that cat, cat. Let me go ahead and save that. Now in my pong.is file, when I want my player to hit the object or move up his arm, is when the ball hits my player object. So right here in my code, when this is true, when the ball hits my player object, I want my player to go to and play. I want my player's cat to go to and play that claw. So I'll go ahead and save him, and I'll run him. Now every time my player is hit, he tells his internal cat self to go ahead and claw the ball. Now if we wanted to add some logic so that his tail will swish randomly, we're going to add a couple of variables. We're going to add a not moving variable we call not moving. It's type Boolean. We're going to add a variable we called counter, and it's of type number. We add those to our instance variables at the top of our class. We initialize those instance variables in our constructor. So I'll initialize not moving to true and counter to 0. And then also inside of our constructor, we're going to add an event listener on the enter frame event, and we're going to call the cat movement function. Let's take a look at that cat movement function. Remember to write this function outside of any other function. Here's our cat movement function. This is why we needed that variable not moving, so that our tail won't continuously swish up and down and cut itself off. So we have an if statement. If the variable not moving is true, then we'll go to and play the tail swish. Remember what our tail swish was. So our tail swish was that frame label here. And from that frame until the end of his little frames, he swishes his tail up and down. We set not moving to false so that when it gets to this if statement again, this will be false and it won't go to and play the tail swish again. And if it keeps on playing the tail swish over and over, what happens is it'll get about here and then start replaying itself, and the tail will just move just a little bit because he won't ever be able to reach the end. So that's why we switch that variable to false, so it'll be false here and it will not go to and play that tail swish again. We then have a counter which we set equal to 0. So while this tail swish is playing, not moving is false. So it'll always come down to this else part and increase our counter. So while he's playing, this will be false and our counter will start increasing. When our counter gets to 25, actually 26, this will become true. So on the 26th frame, this will become true. When that becomes true, we set not moving equal to true. And when we do that, now he's allowed to come into this if statement again and go back and play the tail swish again. So we can run our code and see this happening. And notice that the tail swish does happen pretty okay. But he does happen a little bit too often where he looks very irritated and is swishing way too much. So what we'd like to do is we'd add a little bit of randomness to this. Randomness to his tail swish. So inside of this function cat movement, I'm going to make a num variable. He's of type number. I called him num. And I'm going to use that math random function again. Remember, this returns a number between 0 and 1. And I'm going to multiply it by 100. So now I have a number between 0 and 99. And then I'm going to put an AND statement in here. And I'm going to check to see if that num is greater than 98. So this should happen about 2% of the time. If we're getting a number between 0 and 99, actually this should happen about 1% of the time. Now, albeit that this function is executing 24 times a second, so we should get a number above 98 1% of the time. It should happen. Remember how an AND statement works? This has to be true and this has to be true in order for this whole statement to be true. Let's go ahead and save it and run it. And now you can see that his tail swish is a little bit more random. He's not swishing all of the time. He's still swishing an awful lot. So if I wanted it to be less, what I could do is I could increase this number. So now I'm going to get a number between 0 and 499. And I could say something like, if you're above 480, then go ahead and do your tail swish. You can play around with those numbers and see what works best in your code. And in the next video, we'll go over in detail how to make some movement for your objects.